Despite its name, the demilitarized zone is actually one of the most militarized borders in the world. I think the thing that struck me is it's so calm and peaceful, and if it weren't for the hundreds of soldiers or the enormous North Korean flagpole, you would forget where you were. What's that we can hear now?
이 소리 얘기하는 거예요? 이 소리는 이제 북측에서 이제 그 양석이 그 불 끄는 소리예요.
For a moment we stopped filming and we all stood there in silence, and then we could hear the sound of North Koreans singing over the border, and that was just remarkable. I'm Jean McKenzie, and I am the BBC's sole correspondent covering the entire Korean peninsula, so North and South Korea. When I arrived in Korea, relations between North and South Korea were in this really interesting period of flux, and so things on the peninsula felt a lot more volatile than they had done in quite a number of years. And so when I entered that situation and was seeing tensions escalate, I was thinking, well, who does this actually affect right here, right now? Who's having to deal with this? And then I learned about this community of South Koreans that live inside the demilitarized zone. Right, we can get out.
Good morning. 안녕하세요. How are you? Good morning. This is Jean McKenzie with the BBC.
The demilitarized zone is this strip of land that separates North and South Korea, and it is a buffer zone really between the two countries. So what you have essentially is two countries that are technically still at war, even though they're not fighting.
Please do not make any hand gestures to the north and do not go past the soldiers behind you to the left and right.
Despite its name, the demilitarized zone is actually one of the most militarized borders in the world. So both North and South Korea have hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery pointed in each direction across this strip of no man's land, which is essentially there to keep North and South Korea apart. So to enter this strip of land requires an awful lot of authorization and is quite rare of itself. But to go to this village is incredibly rare. This is a private community, quite a closed community of South Koreans. And so it's not somewhere that journalists can just go to. When we went there, especially for the first time, it felt really special.
So from where we're at right now, we can see from left to right and right to left, a heavily wooded area denotes the border between North and South Korea. There are no fences, there are no barriers, and there are no walls that separate North and South.
So there is nothing to physically stop the North Koreans from walking over into this village here.
Except for us.
Except for you.
That's right.
The demilitarized zone is run by an international peacekeeping force called the United Nations Command. So they were the people that we had to get our permission from. Nobody had actually been given the kind of extensive coverage that we were asking for, which was 3 whole days inside the village to really just observe village life. And get to know the villagers and the soldiers that are protecting them and understand how the village worked. So we had to try and convince the United Nations Command to give us this sort of access. And at first we were told that it just wasn't going to be possible. We were asking for too much. But over the course of a year, going back and forward and speaking to various people inside the organisation, we finally did get to a point where we were happy and they were happy that we could do this.
Inside of each of those little pockets of trees, you can see one right over here. In those pockets are actually North Korean guard posts.
All the team had to wear one of these. And the reason that we had to wear this was so that the North Korean border guards could clearly see that we were media, because they would have been aware of our presence, they would have been watching us. We were a sort of unusual addition to this village, and so those that were surveying the village would have wanted to know what we were about, and we were getting quite close up to the border. So if we hadn't been wearing these, it could have indicated some sort of threat. We did have to ask the UNC if we could keep them at the end. They wanted us to hand them back, but it is always nice for a memento, and they let us have them in the end.
지금은 이렇게 평화로워 보이지만은 이 평화로움 속에도 이 조용한 이 적막함에 깔려 있는 걸 모르실 거예요.
When you were in the village, I think the thing that struck me is it's so calm and peaceful. And if it weren't for the hundreds of soldiers or the enormous North Korean flagpole that looms over everything, you would forget where you were. And it only sort of takes on this eerie quality, I think, when you get right up close to the border. What's that we can hear now?
이 소리 얘기하는 거예요? 이 소리는 이제 북쪽에서 이제 그 양석이 그 불 푸는 소리예요.
For a moment, we stopped filming, and we all stood there in silence. And then we could hear the sound of North Koreans singing over the border. And we could also hear the sound of their tractors and some of their farming equipment. And that was just remarkable, to just be able to stand there and not see into North Korea, but to hear into North Korea. It was interesting to think about being watched by the North Koreans, and that isn't something I think I'd considered an awful lot before we went into the zone. But then to be told by the team on the ground that the North Korean border guards would undoubtedly be watching us and be aware of our presence was just a slightly eerie feeling, I think.
USA 남바하나.
That's right.
Okay.
So we went into Taesong village with the military, but they actually had no bearing on who we spoke to. So they didn't tell us who to talk to, they didn't try and control who we talked to. And when I sat down to do my interviews with people, they weren't present. So they would step outside the room, they would be watching, they'd be keeping us safe, but they weren't there for the interviews themselves.
There must be some sort of restrictions that come with being embedded with the UN military command.
With this kind of story, you just couldn't do it without the military, and we wouldn't be safe to do it without the military. So yes, we do have to move around with them, but I didn't feel restricted. I mean, the village itself is tiny, and what we wanted was to get a good sense of the village, and we were able to explore the whole of it, and we were able to stay after dark and to see how it operated at night, which was a huge concession from the military.
안녕하세요. 주민 체크 왔습니다.
좀 일찍 오지. 그럼 고기 한 입씩 먹을 텐데.
Reporting on this conflict means you really only ever get to see one side of it. You're kind of stuck on one side of the border. Do you feel like you can give the whole picture?
Very, very little actually leaks out of North Korea. So of course, telling that story is challenging, but there are sources of information available to us that make me feel like I'm not just telling one side of the story. No, I mean, we have often a kind of deluge of information from the North Korean state themselves, who put out things almost daily on state media. And yes, it's state media, and of course it's propaganda, but it's still the North Korean government's way of talking to us and telling us their side of the story. So we do have that. And then, of course, we have sources who we speak to who help us better understand what is happening inside the country. And people, crucially, who are so valuable to us, are the people who've managed to escape North Korea and who can tell us what things are like from their perspective. The times that it bothers me to think about North Korean surveillance, or particularly digital surveillance, are the times that I'm working on sensitive stories. So it's when I'm talking to North Korean sources that I really have to protect, you know, whose lives are much more at risk than mine is, or their safety is much more at risk. So those are the times that I think in the past I've become quite paranoid. just thinking that a single text message or a little piece of detail or anything left on a shred of paper or my laptop, could it give away too much? Could it put somebody else's life at risk? And then that's the stuff that keeps me awake at night.
과감하고 역동적인 투쟁으로 충만된
I found out the other day that the North Korean state television had run a clip of one of my live reports talking about their satellite launch in one of their documentaries. So that was the first time I was aware that I had actually made it onto the television in North Korea. So yes, I am aware that they know who I am, and it's crossed my mind sometimes about, do they know where I am in Seoul? Do they have eyes on me? Do they know what I'm doing? I think the best thing about this job and being Seoul correspondent is how varied it is and how many different stories I get to cover. You know, North and South Korea are both these endlessly fascinating places, and they are so different, and yet they are inextricably linked, which adds this kind of extra dimension to the coverage, I think. So, you know, you can be talking about North Korea's relationship with Russia, and then we're talking about South Korea's relationship with China and the United States, and all these big geopolitical pieces that are kind of shifting underneath us at the moment. But then I get to jump into the story of North Korean people and what is happening on the ground there and the humanitarian situation. And then in South Korea, I get to dive into the social issues here. And then you've got the K culture, which, you know, the K-pop and the K-drama, which keeps things light. It's a good antidote to the missiles. What I found the most enjoyable thing about the concert was actually watching it from the fans' perspective. I don't think I'd realised the level of adoration and the kind of love of the fans. You hear about it, but not until I was in the stadium and I was watching how people were reacting to BTS did I really comprehend how great the love is.
In your film, you say that people are giving up hope for reunification. Why is that, do you think?
With each year that goes by, I think there is less hope that North and South Korea will be reunified. And I think even here in South Korea, we see the younger generations being less enthusiastic about the prospect of reunification. But actually, even this year, I think this story has become even more significant because despite reunification maybe looking less and less likely, it's always been the official policy of the North Koreans and the South Koreans that the two countries would reunify peacefully one day. But this year, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, came out and said for the first time, he abandoned this policy of reunification. He essentially said, look, the South Korean people can no longer be considered our brothers and sisters. This is a hostile country. This is an enemy state. And so that is a huge ideological shift from the North Koreans. And it does change the dynamic here. And it does lead us to think about the village of Taesong and what that means for these people living along the border with North Korea. The whole purpose for their village is that they are this beacon of hope for reunification. Do I think that in my lifetime, North Korea will be an open country that will be able to go freely, or that North and South Korea will be reunified? That's a very different question, and I don't know.